Some people can buy the finest table in the city, but they still can't recognize the most valuable person in the room. On a cool Friday evening, rain traced silver lines across the tall windows of Hawthorne House, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, where crystal chandeliers scattered warm light across polished marble floors and every whispered conversation sounded like another business deal worth millions. Claire Bennett moved quietly between the tables, balancing a polished tray with practiced grace. Her white shirt perfectly pressed beneath a black apron that made her nearly invisible to the guests who rarely looked beyond the uniform. She smiled when spoken to, thanked every customer sincerely, and carried herself with a calm confidence that never demanded attention. The dinner rush had already begun when the front doors opened and the atmosphere shifted almost instantly. Conversations softened. Heads turned. Nathan Brooks stepped inside wearing a charcoal suit tailored with understated perfection, an elegant Swiss watch catching the chandelier's light as he adjusted his cuff. At 41, the self-made millionaire had built a reputation as a man who could read people within minutes, making billion-dollar investment decisions with little more than instinct and confidence. Around him followed several executives, all laughing politely at comments that weren't particularly funny, each eager to remain inside his circle of influence. Claire approached with the same composed expression she offered every guest. "Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome to Hawthorne House. My name is Claire, and I'll be taking care of your table tonight." Nathan barely glanced at her before returning his attention to the conversation with his colleagues. "Sparkling water," he said flatly. "And let's not waste time." Claire nodded once. "Of course, sir." Her voice remained warm, steady, impossible to provoke. She disappeared toward the service station with effortless efficiency, while Nathan continued discussing an acquisition that everyone else seemed desperate to impress him about. A few minutes later, Claire returned carrying their drinks with quiet precision. As she placed each glass exactly where it belonged, one executive accidentally nudged his leather portfolio toward the edge of the table. Claire caught it before it slipped onto the floor, setting it back without interrupting anyone's conversation. "Quick reflexes," one man joked with a grin. Nathan finally looked directly at her. His eyes paused only long enough to notice the apron, the order pad, and the name stitched neatly above her pocket. A faint smile formed across his face, the kind born from certainty rather than kindness. "Well," he said loudly enough for everyone at the table to hear, "I suppose that's impressive. For someone who's just a waitress." A few restrained chuckles circled the table. No one intended cruelty. They simply followed the rhythm set by the richest voice in the room. Claire stood perfectly still. Her expression never hardened. Her shoulders never tightened. She simply met Nathan's eyes for one quiet second, as though weighing something far more important than his words. Then she offered the same courteous smile she had given every guest that evening. "I'll give you a few more minutes to look over the menu," she said softly. "If you need anything at all, I'll be nearby." She turned and walked away without the slightest hint of embarrassment, leaving the laughter to fade on its own. Nathan watched her disappear into the crowd of diners. He expected irritation, defensiveness, perhaps even wounded pride. Instead, there had been nothing but remarkable composure. He reached for his glass, but before taking a sip, his eyes drifted toward Claire once again. She had stopped near another table, quietly helping an elderly couple adjust the reading light above their menus before disappearing toward the kitchen. Nathan glanced absent-mindedly at the polished face of his Swiss watch, then back toward the dining room. For reasons he couldn't explain, he suddenly had the strange feeling that the woman he had dismissed only moments earlier had noticed something everyone else in the room, including him, had completely overlooked. Claire never hurried, even when every table in Hawthorne House seemed to need something at the same time. She moved with the quiet rhythm of someone who had learned that calm was more valuable than speed. One family needed an extra chair for their little grandson. A couple celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary could not decide between two desserts. A businessman spilled coffee across important papers just as his phone rang. Claire handled each moment with the same steady smile, never making anyone feel like a burden. She quietly replaced the stained documents with fresh linen napkins before the coffee reached the edge of the table, then returned a few minutes later carrying neatly printed copies that the front desk had helped produce after she politely asked for assistance. The grateful customer never realized that she had solved 3 problems before he had even finished his phone call. Across the dining room, Nathan Brooks noticed more than he intended. Every few minutes his eyes drifted away from financial projections and toward the young waitress who seemed to move through the restaurant without creating the slightest disturbance. She did not entertain guests. She did not seek compliments. She simply noticed what everyone else overlooked. One elderly gentleman struggled to read the menu beneath the soft evening lights. Before he could ask, Claire quietly adjusted the small table lamp until the print became clear. A young mother looked embarrassed as her little daughter accidentally dropped a fork onto the floor. Claire replaced it with a clean one before the child could apologize. Even the restaurant staff seemed calmer whenever she entered the kitchen. There were no dramatic gestures, no raised voices, only quiet efficiency that somehow made everyone else's work easier. Nathan found himself listening less to the discussion around him. One executive was enthusiastically describing quarterly growth forecasts, while another debated investment strategies. Yet Nathan's attention kept wandering across the room. Something about Claire refused to fit inside the simple judgment he had already made. She did not behave like someone hoping to impress wealthy customers. In fact, she barely acknowledged their expensive watches, tailored suits, or confident conversations. She treated every guest with exactly the same level of respect. When a delivery driver stopped briefly near the entrance to ask for a glass of water after carrying heavy boxes through the rain, Claire brought him one with the same kindness she offered the millionaire sitting beneath crystal chandeliers. No hesitation, no difference. Nathan unconsciously followed the exchange until the driver smiled gratefully and continued on his way. One of Nathan's associates laughed quietly. "She takes this job a little too seriously." Nathan gave a small shrug, but for the first time that evening, the remark did not amuse him. Before he could answer, the restaurant manager approached Claire near the service station. Nathan watched from a distance as the manager apologized for a last-minute scheduling change that would require someone to stay several hours longer because another employee had called in sick. Claire listened without interrupting. She glanced briefly toward the rain outside, then simply nodded and accepted the extra shift without complaint. There was no negotiation, no visible frustration, only a quiet, understanding smile that suggested she had already planned to spend those hours somewhere else. As she returned toward the dining room, she paused beside a small vase on an empty table and gently straightened a single white lily that had begun to lean toward the edge. It was such a small gesture that no customer seemed to notice it. No one except Nathan. He looked down at the polished face of his Swiss watch again, suddenly aware that while he measured every minute by profit and opportunity, Claire seemed to measure hers by something entirely different. For the first time in many years, Nathan realized he had spent an entire evening observing someone whose greatest strength could not be purchased, negotiated, or displayed on a balance sheet, and that quiet realization unsettled him far more than he cared to admit. The evening continued beneath the gentle glow of crystal chandeliers, yet Nathan Brooks found himself paying less attention to the numbers on the presentation tablet in front of him than to the quiet rhythm unfolding across the dining room. That alone irritated him. He had built an empire by controlling his focus. Distractions were expensive. Emotions were liabilities. Instinct, discipline, and measurable results had carried him from a modest apartment in Queens to boardrooms overlooking Manhattan. He believed every success could be explained by preparation, every failure by poor judgment. That belief had become the foundation of his life. When he was 27 years old, he had lost his first company because he trusted a charming entrepreneur instead of examining the facts. He had promised himself that mistake would never happen again. Since then, he judged quickly, acted decisively, and rarely looked back. To Nathan, appearances were not everything, but they were often the fastest clues. A tailored suit suggested discipline. Punctuality suggested reliability. Confidence suggested competence. Uniforms, in his mind, usually reflected the role a person was meant to play. It was a system that had served him well for nearly 2 decades. Or so he believed. One of his associates leaned closer. "Nathan," The Weston acquisition should close by Monday if their legal team agrees to the revised terms. Nathan nodded automatically, although he had barely heard the sentence. His attention shifted again as Claire quietly delivered another table's dinner without interrupting a single conversation. There was something unusual about the way people responded to her. They seemed calmer after speaking with her. A frustrated customer lowered his voice instead of raising it. A nervous young couple smiled after she offered a simple reassurance that their anniversary dessert would be ready in just a few minutes. Even the kitchen staff seemed to trust her judgment without hesitation. Nathan had seen executives who commanded respect through authority. He had seen celebrities command attention through fame. Claire appeared to influence people without either. That unsettled him because it did not fit any model he understood. "You are awfully quiet tonight," his oldest business partner, Daniel Mercer, observed with an amused smile. "That usually means you are solving a problem." Nathan gave a faint smile. "Perhaps I am trying to understand one." Daniel followed Nathan's gaze across the room and immediately spotted Claire greeting another table. "The waitress?" he asked with a quiet laugh. Nathan did not answer right away. Instead, he picked up the menu she had placed before him nearly 30 minutes earlier. Every recommendation she had made had been precise, balanced, and surprisingly thoughtful. Nothing extravagant. Nothing designed simply to increase the bill. She had suggested dishes that genuinely complemented one another. It was a small detail, but Nathan noticed details. "Interesting," he murmured almost to himself. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "What is?" Nathan closed the menu slowly. "She never tries to impress anyone." Daniel chuckled. "Maybe because she does not need to." The words lingered longer than either man expected. Nathan looked toward Claire again just as she paused beside a nearby window. Outside, rain continued to fall across the Manhattan streets, blurring the city lights into soft ribbons of gold and silver. For a brief moment she simply watched the rain, her expression thoughtful, peaceful, as though the noise inside the restaurant had disappeared completely. Then another customer quietly called her name. She turned immediately, smiled with genuine warmth, and walked back into the rhythm of her work. Nathan realized something he had never considered before. Every person in the restaurant seemed to be chasing something. Larger contracts, greater recognition, higher profits, better connections. Claire was the only person who appeared completely present where she already was, and somehow that quiet certainty made the millionaire wonder whether success might be measured by something far more difficult than money. Dinner reached its busiest hour as every table filled with conversations, polished silverware, and the soft music drifting from the grand piano near the center of the restaurant. Hawthorne House had become a carefully choreographed performance where every employee moved with purpose, and Claire Bennett remained at the heart of that rhythm without ever becoming its center of attention. Nathan Brooks watched her once again as she approached his table carrying their entrees with perfect balance. She placed each plate exactly where it belonged, describing every dish with quiet confidence before wishing everyone an enjoyable meal. Just as she prepared to leave, Nathan spoke. "Miss Bennett." She turned politely. "Yes, sir?" Nathan leaned back in his chair, his expression calm, almost curious. "You seem very observant." Claire smiled gently. "It is part of my job to notice what people need before they ask." One of the executives laughed. "Then perhaps you can settle a disagreement for us." Nathan looked at the others before returning his attention to Claire. "Tell me which wine on this list pairs best with the dry-aged ribeye, the grilled sea bass, and the truffle risotto all at the same table." It sounded like an ordinary question, but everyone present understood the challenge hidden beneath it. The wine list contained hundreds of selections. Most servers would immediately recommend the most expensive bottle. Claire glanced at the menu for only a second before answering. "I would recommend 2 bottles instead of 1. A Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon for the ribeye, and an Oregon Chardonnay for the sea bass and risotto. 1 bottle cannot bring out the best in every dish tonight." Nathan raised an eyebrow. 2 bottles? That is not the most profitable answer for the restaurant. Claire's expression never changed. "Perhaps not. But it is the most enjoyable answer for the guests." A brief silence settled around the table before one executive chuckled awkwardly. Nathan nodded once. Interesting. Claire excused herself and walked away exactly as calmly as she had arrived. Daniel Mercer smiled across the table. She answered that rather well. Nathan gave no reply. Instead, he looked back toward Claire as another idea formed in his mind. Several minutes later, she returned to refill their water glasses. Nathan spoke again. If you had $100,000 to invest today, where would you put it? Daniel looked surprised. Another executive nearly laughed aloud. Claire paused for only a heartbeat. I would ask several questions before answering. Nathan folded his hands together. Such as, what are your goals? How long can you leave the money invested? How much risk can you tolerate? Are you protecting wealth or trying to grow it? Nathan studied her carefully. You answered my question with 4 more. Claire nodded politely. Because without context, any financial advice would simply be a guess. And responsible people should not guess when someone else's future is involved. The table became unexpectedly quiet. Daniel slowly lowered his fork. Nathan remained expressionless, but something behind his eyes shifted. Claire continued in the same respectful tone. The same investment can be brilliant for one person and a mistake for another. The answer depends less on the market than on the person asking the question. She smiled softly. Would there be anything else you need this evening? Nathan realized he had forgotten the original purpose of the conversation. For the first time in years, someone had challenged his assumptions without sounding defensive, arrogant, or eager to impress him. She had simply answered honestly. No, he said after a long pause. That will be all. Claire thanked him and quietly walked toward another table, leaving behind complete silence. Daniel looked at Nathan with a knowing smile. You were testing her. Nathan slowly reached for his water glass without taking his eyes off the woman disappearing into the warm light of the dining room. Yes, he admitted quietly. And I am beginning to suspect that I asked the wrong questions. Ironically, the moment Nathan decided he would stop thinking about Claire was the exact moment the evening took an unexpected turn. One of his associates received an urgent phone call and immediately excused himself from the table. Within seconds, the relaxed business dinner transformed into a tense discussion. A potential acquisition that had taken nearly 8 months to negotiate was suddenly at risk. A misunderstanding involving the final contract had delayed the electronic signatures, and the attorneys waiting in Chicago needed an answer before the financial markets opened the next morning. Daniel Mercer opened his laptop while another executive searched through a stack of printed documents that had been brought to the restaurant for a final review. Voices became lower but noticeably more anxious. Nathan remained composed, yet his eyes moved rapidly across the pages as he searched for the source of the confusion. One document appeared different from the others. A revised summary listed a payment schedule that did not match the version Nathan remembered approving earlier that afternoon. That cannot be correct, he said quietly. We never agreed to those milestones. One executive frowned. This is the copy that legal emailed before dinner. Another shook his head. No, I am certain there was another version. The conversation became increasingly tangled as several nearly identical documents covered the polished tablecloth. At that moment, Claire approached carrying fresh coffee. She noticed the tension immediately but said nothing. She carefully placed each cup where it belonged, making sure not to disturb the scattered papers. As she reached Nathan's place setting, a single page slipped partially beneath his leather portfolio. Claire instinctively noticed a small detail that no one else had mentioned. In the bottom corner of one document was a tiny revision code printed beneath the date. She had seen similar version markings countless times while organizing banquet contracts for the restaurant manager. Without interrupting, she quietly asked, "Excuse me, sir. May I point out something that might help?" Nathan looked up with mild surprise. Go ahead. Claire gently indicated the page without touching it. These 2 summaries have different revision numbers. This one appears to be revision 7, but the signature page references revision 8. Perhaps everyone is discussing 2 different drafts. The table fell silent. Daniel leaned forward immediately, comparing both documents side by side. His expression changed almost instantly. She is right. Another executive quickly searched his email. Wait, she is absolutely right. Revision 8 arrived 20 minutes after the earlier attachment. I downloaded both without noticing. Nathan looked from the documents to Claire. No one spoke for several seconds. The confusion that had consumed experienced attorneys and financial executives had not been solved through advanced analysis or expensive software. It had been solved because a waitress quietly noticed a single line of small print that everyone else had overlooked. Claire offered a polite smile. I apologize if I interrupted. Nathan slowly shook his head. You did not interrupt. You may have just saved us several hours. Claire simply nodded. I am glad it helped. Without waiting for praise, she collected the empty coffee creamer, straightened a folded napkin that had slipped onto the floor, and continued toward another table as though nothing unusual had happened. Daniel watched her disappear before looking back at Nathan. Most people would have announced that observation the moment they saw it. Nathan remained silent. He stared at the tiny revision number on the page, then toward the dining room where Claire was once again serving guests with the same quiet grace. For the second time that evening, she had done something remarkable without asking anyone to notice. And for the first time in a very long time, Nathan wondered whether the wisest person in the room had been wearing an apron all along. The conversation at Nathan Brooks's table gradually returned to business, but something had quietly changed. Numbers still appeared across laptop screens. Attorneys still exchanged messages. Contracts still required signatures. Yet Nathan's thoughts continued drifting toward the woman who had solved a problem without asking for recognition. Long after the acquisition had been placed back on track, he found himself wondering a question that had never crossed his mind before. Who exactly was Claire Bennett before she put on that apron every evening? He disliked unanswered questions. Throughout his career, uncertainty had always been an invitation to investigate. During a brief pause in the meeting, Nathan excused himself and walked toward the reception desk where the restaurant manager, Olivia Sanders, was reviewing reservations for the following week. Everything satisfactory this evening, Mr. Brooks? She asked with a professional smile. Very much so, Nathan replied. After a brief hesitation, he added, Your waitress, Claire. She is exceptional. Olivia smiled warmly. She certainly is. Nathan waited for additional information, but none came. Has she worked here long? Olivia nodded. Almost 3 years. Before that, Olivia's smile remained polite, but she gently shook her head. I am afraid I do not discuss personal information about my employees. Nathan appreciated the professionalism, even if it left him with no answers. Fair enough, he said with genuine respect. As he turned to leave, an older gentleman seated near the reception desk looked up from his coffee. He had apparently overheard enough of the conversation to recognize the name. Claire? The elderly customer asked quietly. Olivia smiled. Yes, Harold. The man chuckled softly as though remembering something pleasant. She helped me every Tuesday after my eye surgery last year. I could barely read the menu back then. Nathan paused without intending to listen, but Harold continued speaking with quiet admiration. She never made me feel embarrassed. Sometimes she would describe every special from memory because I could not read the print very well. Bright young woman. Nathan nodded politely before returning toward his table. A few minutes later, another employee crossed paths with Claire near the kitchen entrance. The young hostess accidentally dropped several reservation folders across the floor. Before anyone else reacted, Claire calmly knelt beside her, gathered the papers in perfect order, and quietly whispered something that made the visibly stressed hostess smile with relief. Nathan noticed that Claire never behaved as though she were the most capable person in the room, even when evidence suggested she often was. She simply made other people feel more capable themselves. Later in the evening, Daniel Mercer quietly joined Nathan near the windows overlooking the rain-soaked streets below. You have been studying her all night, Daniel observed. Nathan gave a thoughtful smile. I have been trying to understand something. And have you? Nathan looked across the dining room where Claire was carefully helping the anniversary couple choose a dessert. No. The more I observe her, the less she fits the assumptions I made. Daniel folded his arms. Perhaps that is because assumptions rarely tell the whole story. Nathan remained silent. He had already searched public business databases on his phone during a brief break, expecting to discover some obvious explanation. There had been none. No articles. No professional profile that matched the intelligence she displayed. Nothing extraordinary at all. It was almost as if Claire had deliberately chosen a life that invited people to underestimate her. As the rain finally began to slow outside, Nathan watched Claire fold a forgotten child's drawing and place it safely beside the family who had almost left it behind. She did not know anyone had seen the gesture. She simply believed it mattered. Nathan slowly slipped his phone back into his pocket. For years he had trusted public achievements to explain private character. Tonight, for the first time, he began to suspect that the most remarkable chapters of a person's life were often the ones that never appeared on a resume. By the time dessert was being served, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets of Manhattan shimmering beneath reflections of city lights. Most of the dinner guests had begun preparing to leave, but Nathan Brooks remained seated long after the business discussion had ended. His associates exchanged polite goodbyes, collected their briefcases, and headed toward the entrance. Daniel Mercer paused beside Nathan. Coming? Nathan looked toward Claire, who was quietly arranging fresh silverware for the next reservation despite having already worked far beyond her scheduled shift. In a few minutes, he replied. Daniel smiled knowingly before walking away without another word. The restaurant had grown noticeably quieter. Soft piano music drifted through the nearly empty dining room as staff prepared for the late evening guests. Claire noticed Nathan still sitting alone and approached with the same calm professionalism she had shown throughout the night. "May I bring you some fresh coffee?" she asked. Nathan looked up and smiled for what felt like the first genuine time that evening. "I would appreciate that." A few moments later she returned carrying a fresh cup. She placed it gently before him and stepped back. Nathan hesitated before speaking. "Would you mind if I asked you something that has nothing to do with dinner?" Claire answered with an easy smile. "As long as I can answer honestly." Nathan nodded. "You seem unusually comfortable solving complicated problems." Claire considered the question for a moment before replying. "Problems usually become smaller when people stop trying to prove they are the smartest person in the room." Nathan let out a quiet laugh. "That is not the answer I expected. Most worthwhile conversations rarely begin with expected answers," Claire replied. Nathan studied her expression. There was no hint of superiority, no desire to impress him. She simply spoke as someone who had learned difficult lessons and no longer needed to advertise them. "Earlier tonight," Nathan continued, "you understood those contract revisions almost immediately. Then you answered an investment question more thoughtfully than some financial consultants I have hired." Claire gently wrapped both hands around the coffee pot she still carried. "Information appears everywhere if people pay attention." Nathan shook his head. "That sounds too simple." Claire smiled. "Simple does not always mean easy." For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The silence felt comfortable rather than awkward. Finally, Nathan asked the question that had occupied his thoughts all evening. "Why are you working here?" Claire glanced toward the large windows where the wet pavement reflected the restaurant lights like scattered stars. "Because this is where I need to be right now." Nathan frowned slightly. "You could probably be doing something very different." Claire nodded once. "Perhaps." "Then why not?" She looked back at him with quiet certainty. "Because success is not only about finding the highest position. Sometimes it is about standing exactly where the people you love need you most." Nathan listened without interrupting. Claire continued in the same calm voice. "A few years ago, I believed my career would define my life. Then someone in my family became seriously ill. Plans changed. Priorities changed. I discovered that titles can wait. Time with the people who matter cannot." Nathan lowered his eyes to the untouched coffee before him. Those words reached deeper than he expected. He had spent decades measuring life by calendars, quarterly reports, and financial milestones. He suddenly realized he could not remember the last ordinary evening he had spent with his own father before he passed away years earlier. Claire had not criticized his choices. She had simply described her own. Yet somehow her quiet honesty carried more weight than any lecture ever could. Nathan slowly looked back at her, understanding that the woman he had dismissed because of an apron had revealed a kind of wisdom that no boardroom, no investment portfolio, and no fortune could ever guarantee. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The quiet between Nathan Brooks and Claire Bennett felt different now, no longer separated by wealth, titles, or uniforms, but by two completely different ways of measuring a successful life. Nathan slowly stood from his chair, buttoned his jacket, and glanced around the nearly empty restaurant. The last few guests were gathering their coats while members of the staff quietly reset tables for the following afternoon. He looked back at Claire with an expression far removed from the confidence he had carried through the front doors only hours earlier. "Claire," he said gently, "when I first arrived tonight, I believed I understood who you were before you ever spoke a single sentence." She listened without interrupting. "I looked at your apron," Nathan continued, "and I decided that it told me everything I needed to know. That was unfair." Claire smiled softly, not with satisfaction, but with understanding. "Most people make quick decisions. It saves time." Nathan shook his head. "Sometimes it also costs us something far more valuable than time." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed an elegant business card embossed with his company's name. He held it out toward her. "If you ever decide you want a different career, I would be honored to introduce you to anyone you wish. Finance, consulting, management, whatever interests you. I have no doubt someone with your mind would succeed anywhere." Claire looked at the card for a brief moment before accepting it respectfully with both hands. She did not react with excitement. She did not immediately place it into her pocket. She simply looked at it as though it were a thoughtful gesture rather than a life-changing opportunity. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "That is very generous." Nathan waited, expecting questions about salaries, positions, or opportunities. None came. Instead, Claire carefully placed the card inside her order book and smiled. "I will keep it." Nathan laughed quietly. "You are not going to ask what the position pays?" Claire smiled a little wider. "No. Why not?" She looked around the peaceful dining room before answering. "Because kindness should be appreciated before it is evaluated." Nathan lowered his eyes for a second. That simple sentence settled into his thoughts with surprising weight. He realized that throughout his career he had judged nearly every opportunity by what it could produce. Claire had judged his offer by the intention behind it instead. At that moment, Olivia Sanders approached to thank Nathan and his guests for choosing the restaurant. Before leaving, Nathan turned toward both women. His voice was calm, yet clear enough for the nearby staff members to hear. "Earlier this evening," he said, "I made a comment that I wish I had never made." Claire looked at him with quiet curiosity. Nathan continued without hesitation. "I judged someone I did not know. That was my mistake, not hers." The dining room grew still. No one appeared uncomfortable. There was simply an unexpected silence filled with respect. Nathan looked directly at Claire. "I owe you an apology. Not because you proved me wrong, but because I forgot that dignity has nothing to do with a job title." Claire's expression remained warm. Apology accepted. There was no triumph in her voice. No desire to make the moment larger than it needed to be. She accepted his words with the same quiet grace she had carried throughout the evening. Nathan understood then that she had never been trying to win an argument. She had simply refused to let another person's opinion determine her worth. As he walked toward the entrance, he glanced back one final time. Claire was already helping another employee fold fresh linen napkins, smiling as though nothing extraordinary had happened at all. It occurred to Nathan that the greatest lesson of the evening had not been delivered from a stage, a classroom, or a boardroom. It had been quietly demonstrated by a woman who never once asked anyone to notice her, yet somehow left an unforgettable impression on everyone who truly did. The cool night air greeted Nathan Brooks as he stepped outside Hawthorne House, carrying with it the clean scent of rain and the distant sound of traffic moving through Manhattan. His driver opened the car door, but Nathan remained standing on the sidewalk for a moment, looking back through the restaurant's tall windows. Inside, Claire Bennett was still wearing the same black apron, quietly helping another employee stack polished glasses before wiping down a nearby table. Nothing about her appearance suggested that the evening had changed her life. In truth, it had changed his. As the car pulled away from the restaurant, the glowing lights slowly disappeared behind the city streets. Yet Nathan found himself replaying every conversation from the evening. He remembered the confidence with which he had judged her before learning a single fact about her. He remembered the quiet way she corrected a costly misunderstanding without seeking praise. He remembered the thoughtful answers that never sounded rehearsed and the simple wisdom that seemed to come from experience rather than ambition. Most of all, he remembered that she had accepted his apology with kindness instead of satisfaction. That was the moment he understood the difference between proving someone wrong and helping someone become better. Over the following weeks, Nathan noticed subtle changes in himself. During meetings, he listened longer before speaking. He asked junior employees for their opinions before making final decisions. He learned the names of the reception staff in his office building and began thanking the maintenance team that arrived before sunrise each morning. None of these gestures made newspaper headlines. None increased the value of his company. Yet each one quietly reminded him that respect was not something reserved for titles. It was something every person deserved before earning anything else. One afternoon, nearly a month after that unforgettable dinner, Nathan received a handwritten note delivered to his office. There was no expensive stationery, no company logo, only careful handwriting on a simple white card. Claire thanked him for his kindness, explained that her mother's health had improved, and said she was grateful for his offer, even though she had chosen to remain at the restaurant for the time being. She ended the note with one sentence that Nathan read several times before placing it carefully inside the drawer of his desk. She wrote that meaningful work is not always determined by where we stand, but by how we treat the people standing beside us. Nathan never contacted her again to persuade her otherwise. He respected her decision because he finally understood that success chosen freely is more valuable than success defined by someone else. Months later, whenever business associates praised his ability to read people, Nathan would quietly smile to himself, remembering the evening he had been completely wrong. He no longer believed that intelligence wore a particular suit or that dignity belonged only to impressive professions. Sometimes the wisest voice spoke softly. Sometimes the strongest character wore an apron instead of a tailored jacket. And sometimes the greatest lesson arrived not through a spectacular achievement, but through ordinary kindness repeated without expecting recognition. Somewhere across the city, Claire continued serving coffee, greeting strangers with genuine warmth, and making countless small moments a little brighter without realizing how many lives she quietly influenced. Nathan continued leading his company, but with a different measure of success than the one he had carried for most of his life. Because in the end, money had introduced him to countless remarkable places, but one ordinary evening inside a neighborhood restaurant taught him the truth he had been searching for all along. Never measure a person's worth by the work they do today, because character is often building a story that titles alone could never tell.